She had not meant to die on his doorstep. But the cold did not ask permission, and her legs had stopped obeying her somewhere between the tree line and the iron gates. And now the snow was very soft beneath her cheek, and the world was going quietly dark at the edges. That was how Sera first came to the palace of the Alpha King, not as a dignitary, not as a supplicant, not as a bride chosen from the finest bloodlines in the Northern Territories. She came as a body in the snow, a collapsed, half-frozen, entirely insignificant body, face down in 3 inches of fresh powder, with no wolf and no rank and no right to be within a mile of those black iron gates. She had one thing, and it was a secret she had carried. So long it had become more bone than thought. She was dying, and she was in love with a man who did not know she existed. She had been walking for 4 days. The truth of that, when Sera later tried to articulate it. First to herself, lying in a bed so warm it felt like accusation, and then to others who asked in the careful voices people reserve for the fragile, was that she had not set out to reach the Alpha King's palace. She had set out to reach the border, the eastern border, where the mountains dropped into the neutral territories, and a woman without a pack could disappear into the anonymous sprawl of ungoverned land and not be someone's burden anymore. She had not reached the border. She had reached him instead. Or rather, she had reached the outer edge of his world, had run out of walking and warmth and will, and had folded down into the snow like a letter no one was expecting. The gates were the last thing she remembered before the dark. Enormous, black, forged iron, and on them the embossed seal of House Varek. 2 wolves circling a crown, mouths open, not in aggression but in something that looked, at that distance, in that failing light, almost like song. She thought it was a beautiful thing to die looking at. She was wrong about the dying, as it turned out. Sera had grown up with the particular, persistent wrongness of being the daughter of a woman who had mated beneath her station, and a man who had not survived to see whether it mattered. Her mother, Lena, had been a mid-rank wolf from the Ashfin pack. Not powerful, not prominent, but genuinely ranked, with a wolf inside her that responded to pack bonds and hierarchy in all the normal ways. Her father had been something different, something quieter, a man who shifted in secret, in the woods behind their small house, and never once discussed what he was or where he had come from, and who died when Sera was 6 years old from a fever that should not have taken a wolf but did anyway, which told you something about how lightly he had sat inside his own nature. What Sera had inherited from the combination of them was not easy to describe. She had a wolf. She was certain of that, the same way she was certain she had a heartbeat. It was there, she could feel the presence of it, a warm and watchful something sitting just behind her sternum. But the wolf did not respond the way other wolves responded. It did not surface for the moon. It did not bristle at dominance challenges or settle into the comfort of pack bonds. It simply sat there, quiet and enormous and utterly patient, like something waiting for a signal that had not yet been sent. The Ashfin pack had tolerated her for 11 years after her mother died. Tolerated being the precise word, delivered with all the warmth the word implies. She had cooked and cleaned and kept herself small, and in return, they had not cast her out into the cold, which they reminded her of frequently and with great sincerity, as if this restraint were a daily gift they were choosing to extend rather than withdraw. They withdrew it the week she turned 23. It was not dramatic. That was the thing she returned to most often in the long, cold hours of the walk, the absence of drama. The alpha of the Ashfin pack, a broad, self-satisfied man named Durin, had called her before the pack council on a Tuesday morning and explained, with the measured patience of a man delivering news he found personally inconvenient, that she had never truly been Ashfin, that her status had been a courtesy as extended to her mother's memory, that the courtesy had a time limit which had now elapsed, and that she was welcome to gather her belongings and depart by evening. She had gathered her belongings. She had departed by evening. She had taken the road east, because it was the only direction that felt like it wasn't pointing back towards something. She had a blanket, a change of clothes, a small amount of currency that ran out on the second day, and a pair of boots that had been adequate for the Ashfin territory, which was considerably further south than the road she found herself walking. By the third day, the road north had begun to curve, without her intending it. She told herself it was the terrain, the natural slope of the land directing her footfall. She did not examine the thought more closely than that. By the fourth day, she was walking directly toward the northern border of the Alpha King's territory, toward his winter palace, toward the palace she had heard of her entire life and never had any reason to approach. And her feet were so cold she could no longer feel them, and somewhere in the numb, exhausted fog of her mind, a single thought was circling like a bird over water. She had heard his name since childhood. Every wolf in every pack in every territory had heard his name since childhood. Kael Varek, the Alpha King, the man who had united the northern packs after the fracture wars, who ruled from the winter palace with a coldness that the stories described as absolute, who had never taken a queen, who had never once in 15 years of rule shown the kingdom anything warmer than efficiency. She had heard all of this. She had believed all of this. She had also, at the age of 19, caught a glimpse of him. Just a glimpse. A procession through a border town. The Alpha King, traveling with his guard on some territorial business that did not concern her or anyone else she knew. She had been standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, craning her neck like everyone else, expecting the cold efficiency the stories promised. What she had not expected was the brief, unguarded moment when his procession paused. Some minor obstruction in the road, and he had turned in his saddle, and for 3 or 4 seconds he had looked directly at the sky above the town with an expression that had nothing cold in it at all. It was not warmth exactly. It was more like longing, like a man looking at something he did not believe he was allowed to want. She had been 19, and she had not understood what she was seeing. She understood it better now. She had also, if she was being entirely honest with herself, never quite stopped thinking about it. But she was not walking to the Alpha King's palace because of a glimpsed expression 4 years ago. She was not so far gone in foolishness as that. She was walking there because her feet were carrying her somewhere, and her mind had run out of arguments for any particular destination, and because the palace was north, and north was where the road was, and she was very, very cold. She was also, she acknowledged in the last semi-lucid moments before her legs gave out entirely, possibly dying. The cold had moved past discomfort and pain and into the second phase, the quiet phase, the phase where everything becomes manageable and soft and slightly unreal. She knew enough to know that the soft phase was worse than the pain phase. She knew it and understood it and felt, with great detachment, entirely unable to do anything about it. The gates were iron. The embossed wolves were circling. The snow was soft. She did not feel herself fall. The cold of the floor told him before the shout did. Kael Varek was not a man who felt the cold. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, born to the Varek bloodline, a line that had produced wolves of unusual power for 6 consecutive generations, and had also, as a secondary gift, or perhaps a natural consequence, produced men who ran warm, always warm. He had stood in snowstorms and felt them as aesthetic events rather than physical threats. He had never in his adult life required a coat. He felt the cold now, a precise, sudden, directional cold, coming from the north face of the palace grounds, cutting through the warmth of the great hall where he was reviewing Border Patrol reports, with the same clean sharpness as a blade laid flat against the back of the neck. He was on his feet before his captain finished the shout. His captain, Brennan, was a man not easily alarmed. He had served with Kael through 2 border campaigns and a succession crisis, and one spectacularly terrible winter when 3 packs had simultaneously attempted territorial challenges during a blizzard. And through all of it, Brennan had maintained the temperament of a man who had seen everything and found it, on reflection, about as expected. So when Brennan's shout carried through the hall, with the particular high note that meant unexpected, Kael did not pause to reach for his coat. He went through the north gate at a pace that his guard had to run to match. She was face down in the snow, 3 feet from the iron gate, and the first thing he noticed, before her age, before her condition, before anything that could be called rational assessment, was the heat. Not warmth, heat. It was coming off her the way heat comes off an ember that looks cold but isn't. The way something looks extinguished but will, if you hold your hand close enough, teach you your error. She was collapsed in the snow, unconscious, barely breathing, and she was radiating a heat that had nothing to do with body temperature, and everything to do with something he had not encountered in 15 years of ruling the northern packs. Not once. Not in any of the dominance challenges or the political marriages proposed to him or the formal mate presentations performed at every major gathering with escalating desperation by the families of eligible wolves. He crouched over her without deciding to. His hand found her face without the usual interval of thought that preceded his actions. He turned her over carefully, clearing the snow from her cheek, and the cold from her skin went through his palm like a signal. Urgent, claiming, unmistakable, and he thought, with the absolute unhurried clarity of a man who has just had the most important thought of his life. Oh, he had always believed, in the quiet private part of himself, that he never showed anyone, that the mate bond was real. He had kept believing it through 15 years of no evidence, through a decade and a half of political pressure and pack expectation, and the very reasonable counsel of his advisers that a king who had not produced an heir by 40 was a king creating a succession problem. He had kept believing it the way a man keeps a single candle burning in a room he has mostly given up waiting in. He had not expected it to announce itself like this. He gathered her up without hesitation. She was lighter than she should have been. Malnourished, he registered. Cold to the core, her lips faintly blue, her pulse present but too slow and too faint, her breathing shallow. She was wearing clothes adequate for mild cold, not for the northern winter, and she had clearly been walking for some time in them. Her boots were completely inadequate. Her hands, when he checked them, were past the shivering stage, which was worse than shivering. He carried her through the north gate and into the palace, and Brennan cleared the way without being asked. And the household staff, who had 45 collective years of experience in reading the Alpha King's silences, read this particular silence with great care and made no comments and asked no questions, and had a room prepared and warm within minutes. Kael sat beside her bed for 3 hours. He did not, in those 3 hours, examine very carefully why he was sitting beside the bed of an unconscious stranger he had found in the snow. He was aware that this was something he would need to examine. He was also aware that the cold he had felt before he reached her had not returned, and that the warmth in the room, a warmth that was not entirely explainable by the fire in the grate, was contingent somehow on proximity. He sat in the chair beside the bed, and he was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. And he looked at her face, which was becoming less blue and more something else, and he thought about the candle in the room he had mostly given up waiting in. He thought, quite specifically and with great care, about what it would mean if the mate bond had declared itself over an unconscious, frost-bitten stranger who had collapsed outside his gates in the snow, with no pack affiliation, no name he knew, no explanation for her presence, and no awareness whatsoever that she had just turned his life into something completely different from what it had been 4 hours ago. He thought about all of this, and then he stayed in the chair and waited for her to wake up. She woke up believing she was dead. This was a reasonable hypothesis. The room was warm in a way that exceeded anything in her experience of material warmth. Not just temperature, but texture. A warmth that seemed to come from the walls and the air and the weight of the blanket, and from some additional direction she could not immediately locate. The ceiling was high, and the stone was cut in fine courses, and there was a fire in a fireplace that was larger than the entire living space of the cottage she had shared with two other packless women in the last year of her time with the Ashfin. The bed she was lying in was the kind of bed she had previously only encountered as a concept. She was not dead. She arrived at this conclusion through the secondary hypothesis that death did not include this quality of headache. She moved very carefully into a sitting position and became aware, in immediate sequence, of the following. Her hands were wrapped in warm cloth and felt distant and strange. Her feet were the same. There was a man sitting in a chair beside her bed. The man was Kael Varek. She went absolutely still. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not cold, none of the coldness the stories described. Not warm, exactly, either. It was the careful expression of a man who has reached a conclusion he is still in the process of deciding how to present. "You're awake," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, more even. There was a quality to it that moved through her chest in a way that had nothing to do with the content of the words. "I'm awake," she agreed, because there was nothing else she was presently capable of contributing. "You were outside my gates," he said. "Yes," she said. "In the snow," he said. "Yes," she said. There was a pause. He did not seem uncomfortable with the pause. She was extremely uncomfortable with the pause. But her discomfort was happening at a remove, filtered through the shock of finding herself in this room, in this bed, looking at this man. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. "Sera," she said. "Lena's daughter from the Ashfin territory. Though," she stopped. "Though I don't suppose the Ashfin affiliation is accurate anymore. They asked me to leave." She heard herself say this with the flat tone of someone reporting weather conditions. She was aware, distantly, that there was a large amount of feeling attached to those words that she was not currently accessing. The shock was serving as very effective insulation. Something moved across his face at that. It was too quick and too controlled for her to read clearly, but it was there. "Why were you on the road?" he asked. "I was heading east," she said, "to the neutral territories. I thought." She stopped again, then finished honestly, because she could not think of a reason to be anything other than honest, sitting in his bed in his palace with his hands. She looked down. She realized with a slow, warm shock that the cloth wrapping her hands was not medical wrapping, but his coat, folded and rewrapped around her fingers, still carrying the warmth of him. "I thought I might disappear there," she said. Not die. Just become invisible. There's no pack structure in the neutral territories. I thought I might be less of a problem there." He was quiet for a moment that felt geological in its weight. "A problem to whom?" he said. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an intensity that was not aggressive. Nothing about him was aggressive. She was registering, which was strange for a man with the dominant signature. She could feel radiating off him like a second form of heat. He was powerful in a way that should have made her wolf flatten itself into submission, should have made her instincts go sideways with the particular dread of encountering a dominant she had no standing with. Instead, her wolf, that quiet, enormous, watchful thing that never responded to anything the way it was supposed to, was doing something she had never felt it do before. It was leaning forward, toward him, like a compass needle that had just found north. She said, "A problem to everyone, mostly," which was the truth but not all of it, and looked back down at his coat wrapped around her hands, and thought, with a clarity that felt dangerous, that she was in a great deal of trouble of a kind she had absolutely no preparation for. She stayed for 3 days before anyone made it official. Kael had given no orders about the woman in the north wing room. He had not needed to. Brennan, who had been with him long enough to read silences with professional accuracy, had quietly ensured that meals went to the room at regular intervals, that the fire was maintained, that no one disturbed her rest. The household staff, as previously noted, had 45 years of collective experience, reading the Alpha King's silences, and were fully capable of reading this one. What they could not read, what Kael himself was in the process of reading, was what came next. The difficulty was not the mate bond. The mate bond was the clearest thing he had encountered in 15 years of ruling the northern packs, which was either a relief or a complication, or, very likely, both. The difficulty was everything around the mate bond. The difficulty was that she was packless, rank-stripped, walking to the neutral territories to become invisible, and that bringing her into his household, into his life, into his role, would require a series of confrontations with the pack structure he governed that he needed to navigate with care. His counsel was the first obstacle. He knew this the way he knew the border topography, thoroughly from long acquaintance. On the second morning, he went to her room himself with breakfast, a thing that generated from the household staff a collective silence so complete it was practically architectural. She was sitting up in bed, awake, and she had clearly been awake for some time. She looked better. The blue was gone from her lips, her color was returning, and the particular careful stillness of someone in shock had relaxed into something more like a person as she normally was. He found he was curious about who she normally was. He found, more precisely, that he was hungry to know. He set the breakfast tray on the table beside her bed and sat in the chair and looked at her, and she looked back at him with dark eyes that held a question she was not quite asking. "You have a wolf," he said, because he had been thinking about it since the first moment and he wanted it said between them. She went still. "I do," she said carefully. "Not a normal one," he said. "Not accusation. Statement." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. It doesn't function the way other wolves function. It never has. It doesn't surface for the moon. It doesn't respond to pack hierarchy the way it should. It just..." She pressed her hand flat to her sternum, and the gesture was so unconscious and so familiar that it told him more than the words did. "It just sits here, waiting for something." He looked at her hand against her sternum, and he said, very quietly, "What does it feel like right now?" The question clearly surprised her. She took a moment with it, genuine and unguarded, and then she said, "Like it found something it was waiting for, which doesn't make sense," she added immediately, the honesty running ahead of her caution. "Because I'm lying in your bed, which is, you are the Alpha King, and I am nobody, and this is the most inexplicable situation I have ever been in." He said, "You're in my bed because you collapsed in my snow." A pause. Then, "And you are not nobody." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you being kind to me?" she said. It was the question he had been expecting and the one he found most difficult to answer in a way that was true, without being so much more than she was ready for. He settled for a partial truth. "Because it costs nothing and you needed it," he said. "And because there is something I want to understand about you, and I can't understand it if you disappear to the neutral territories." She stared at him. "Stay," he said. It came out less like a king's command and more like something else, something rawer and less composed than he intended. And he heard the rawness in it and did not try to correct it. "For a while longer at least, while you recover." She looked down at her hands, bare now, the coat wrapping replaced overnight with proper bandaging by his healers. She turned her palms up in her lap, studying them as if they held something. "All right," she said quietly. He stood, which was how he ended conversations, and then paused, which was not something he did. "The gardens are cleared this time of year," he said. "If you want to walk when you're steady enough, the south garden is sheltered. The snow doesn't collect there." He left before she could respond to that, which was possibly cowardly. He decided not to examine it. The days that followed were not what either of them expected, or rather, they were more than what either of them had prepared for, which was a different kind of surprise. Sera, who had spent the last 4 years making herself small, found that smallness was not easy to maintain in the palace, not because anyone demanded more of her, but because the palace itself seemed to disagree with the project. The rooms were large. The gardens were beautiful. The library. She found the library on the fourth day by following a hallway she had taken a wrong turn into. Held more books than she had seen in her entire life combined, and she stood in the doorway of it for a full minute before she could convince her feet to go in. Kael found her there an hour later, cross-legged on the floor with 3 books open around her and a fourth in her lap, apparently so absorbed that she did not hear him come in. He stood in the doorway for a moment that was longer than strictly necessary. She looked up and went red in the manner of someone caught at something she is not sure is allowed. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I should have asked." "Don't apologize for reading," he said, and something in his chest was doing something he had not experienced before. A kind of pressure that was not painful and not nothing, more like the feeling of a room that has been closed for a long time opening onto unexpectedly warm air. He walked into the library and stood before the shelves, looking at the titles, buying himself the habitual composure he relied on. "What are you reading?" She held up the one in her lap. It was the 3rd volume of a philosophical text on pack governance that he had read and reread so many times his own annotations filled the margins. He turned and looked at her. She was studying the page with an expression of focused disagreement. "The premise in chapter 4 is wrong," she said, apparently forgetting to be intimidated. He argues that pack stability requires the suppression of individual rank claims, but that's exactly backward. Pack instability comes from suppression, not from the claims themselves. If you suppress the claims, they don't disappear. They go underground and they rot the foundation from below. She stopped, looked up, went red again. "I'm sorry. I'm reading your books without permission and criticizing them." That's accurate," he said. She blinked. "Your analysis. It's accurate. I annotated the same objection in chapter 4. He paused. 12 years ago, when I first read it. Before I governed anything large enough to test the theory. I've tested it since." She looked at him with an expression that was doing something to him he did not have adequate vocabulary for. They talked for 2 hours. He sat in the chair by the reading table, and she sat on the floor with the books around her, and they talked about pack governance and political theory and the nature of rank and the particular problem of the borderlands, and she was sharp and unsparing, and sometimes wrong in interesting ways, and occasionally right in ways that reordered the problem for him, and at no point during those 2 hours did she appear to remember that she was talking to the Alpha King, which was, he recognized this, sitting in the chair, feeling the warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. The most extraordinary gift anyone had given him in years. The council met on the 6th day after her arrival. Kael had known it was coming. His council, 5 senior wolves, the representatives of the 5 largest pack affiliations in the Northern Territory, men who had supported his rule and also considerable energy managing it in the directions they preferred, had been patient for 6 days, which was approximately 5 days more patience than he had expected from them. They met in the East Chamber, which was the formal chamber, which was the choice that told him everything about the register they had decided on. "There is a woman in the North Wing," his senior advisor, Lord Casvin, said. Casvin was 70 years old, had been his father's advisor and then his, and delivered uncomfortable information with the practiced neutrality of a man who had been delivering it for decades. "There is," Kael said. "She is packless," Casvin said. "She is," Kael said. "And unranked," said another council member, Lord Draven, whose pack affiliation was Ashvin. Kael noted this with a calm that cost him something. "The Ashvin Alpha has been in contact. He understands she has taken up residence in the palace. She is recovering from exposure," Kael said. "She was found at the palace gate. The palace does not turn people away from its gate in winter." "No," Casvin agreed. "The palace does not. But the palace does not typically install them in the North Wing guest rooms and bring them breakfast personally, either." He said this gently. He was the only one in the room who could have said it. Kael was quiet for a moment. He had prepared for this conversation. He had prepared specific things to say in it, careful, staged, politically managed things that would give him the room he needed without revealing the full scope of what he was dealing with. He looked around the table at the men who had managed the political landscape of his kingdom for 15 years, who had worked hard and effectively, and often with genuine loyalty, and who had absolutely no framework for what he was about to tell them. He told them anyway. "She is my mate," he said. The silence that followed had several distinct layers. The first was surprise. The second was calculation. The third, the one that came after Casvin's expression shifted from surprise through calculation to something more complicated, was the political landscape of the Northern Territories reorganizing itself in real time. "You are certain," Casvin said finally. "Yes," Kael said. Draven said carefully. "The Ashvin Alpha is a council ally. If his decision to separate her from the pack is treated as his decision to discard his own pack member," Kael said, and his voice was level, but the room heard what was under the level, "will be reviewed, not because of her connection to me. Because the protection of pack members is a covenant, not a courtesy, and the Ashvin Alpha appears to have misunderstood the difference." Another silence. Draven went carefully expressionless. "She has no rank," Lord Casvin said. He was not arguing. He was laying out the terrain, the way he always laid out terrain, so that it could be navigated rather than stumbled over. "Not yet," Kael said. He watched Casvin process the weight of those two words. "The northern packs will have questions," Casvin said at last, in the tone of a man beginning a long and careful journey. "The northern packs," Kael said, "can have them." He had not expected the hardest part to come from her. He brought her the news of the council meeting that evening. Not all of it, not yet, not the political machinery that had begun to turn, but the fact of it. He told her that his council knew she was here, and that her status in the palace had moved from recovery guest to something less ambiguous. She went very still in the way she did when something mattered more than she wanted it to. He had learned this about her in 6 days. She went still on the outside when things mattered on the inside, the inverse of people who show everything. "What does that mean?" she said. He said carefully, "It means I've told them you will be staying." She looked at him across the fireplace, where they had been sitting, she in the reading chair she had apparently adopted as hers. He in the chair beside it that he had apparently, without discussion, conceded to her spatial claim. Outside the window the snow was falling again, the way it fell in the northern winter, quietly and continuously and without dramatic announcement. "You told your council that," she said, "without asking me." He had walked into this. He recognized the moment. "I did," he said. "I'm not." She stopped. Started again. "I appreciate what you've done. You carried me in out of the snow. You were kind to me. The books and the breakfast and the—" She stopped again, and when she spoke the next time her voice was different, quieter and more careful. "The conversations. I don't take any of that lightly. But I am packless and unranked, and the last thing anyone in your kingdom will want is for their king too. I am not the right person for whatever this is." The words landed with the specific weight of things said from genuine conviction rather than false modesty. He understood the difference. He had needed to. "Why?" he said. She looked at him. "Because I have a broken wolf and no pack and no family and no rank and no—" "Why does any of that make you wrong?" he said. He was not arguing with her. He was asking the question the way he asked questions in the library. The way he had learned to ask questions with her. Directly. Because she answered directly. And directness was the only currency that worked between them. "You told me pack instability comes from suppression of claims, not from the claims themselves. Why are you suppressing yours?" The silence stretched. Her wolf was visible in her eyes right now, the one that usually hid behind her composure. He could see the forward lean of it, the compass needle quality, the enormous patient creature straining toward him. And he thought about the warmth that followed her everywhere in the palace, the particular warmth that was not temperature, but something older and truer than temperature, and he waited. Because I'm afraid, she said. It cost her to say it. He could see exactly what it cost. So am I, he said. She stared at him. Kael Varek, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. 15 years on the throne, the man the stories described as absolute cold. Telling a collapsed stranger in his library that he was afraid. He watched her process this. He watched something shift in her face, something that had been held rigid, beginning to move. Of what? She said. Of having waited for something for 15 years, he said, and then making a mistake with it. She was quiet for a very long moment. The snow fell outside. The fire did what fires do. You feel it too, she said. It was not a question. It was more like a verdict she had been reaching toward and had finally arrived at. Yes, he said. Since when? She said. Since your face was in the snow, he said. And my hand touched your cheek. Since before I had any information about you at all. He paused. That bothered me for approximately 6 hours. And then I was in a room with you for 2 hours, talking about pack governance, and I stopped being bothered. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same country as a laugh. And it did something to his chest that he decided not to try to describe. I don't know how to be someone's mate, she said. I don't know how to be a queen. I don't know. I've spent 4 years being a problem that people wanted to stop having. I don't know how to be something else. You already are something else, he said. You've been something else since you walked into the library and told me a governance text I've owned for 20 years has an error in chapter 4. She looked at him, and he could see the thing in her, the constraint and the wanting, the suppressed claim fighting the fear, the enormous patient wolf finally hearing the signal it had been waiting for, and beneath all of it the specific exhaustion of someone who has been bracing against the cold for so long they have forgotten that not everywhere is cold. He said quietly, How could I not want you exactly as you are? She closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had changed. The change was not immediate. She did not leap from her chair and declare anything. She looked at him and then looked at the fire and then looked back at him. And she said, You need to understand that my wolf is going to do something when I stop holding it back. It's been waiting a long time and it's very large. I don't know what it will look like. Show me, he said. She let go. The warmth that had been sitting at the edge of the room, hovering at the threshold like a something that had not been invited in, poured forward all at once. It was not light. It was not fire. It was heat of the kind he had felt the first moment his hand touched her face. Ancient and claiming and specific. The heat of something that had been waiting underground for years and had finally, unambiguously, broken the surface. His own wolf answered. He had not expected the answer to feel like relief. He had not expected 15 years of careful governance and deliberate distance, and the slow, patient ache of a candle in a room he had mostly given up waiting in to resolve itself into something this simple. His wolf turning toward her wolf, in the way something falls toward the thing it has always been falling toward, without drama or hesitation or any of the resistance he had spent 15 years cultivating. She was looking at him with wide eyes. She said, Yes, he said. That's what it always was, she said. My wolf, that's what it was waiting to do, this whole time. Her voice had a quality he had not heard in it before. Not the careful flatness, not the composed distance, but something younger and older simultaneously, something that had just recognized itself. He stood from his chair. The distance between the chairs was not large. He crossed it in 2 steps, and she was looking up at him, and he cupped her face in both hands with the deliberate carefulness of a man handling the most important thing he has ever held. He said, You collapsed outside my gates in the snow. I did, she said. I carried you in, he said. You did, she said. And I am not, he said, with the absolute, unhurried clarity of a man who has just made the most important decision of his life and found it not a decision at all but a recognition. Going to let you leave. She reached up and put her hands over his, and her wolf was a warm and enormous and patient thing finally released into what it had always been, and she said, "I know." The mate bond completed itself in the space between those two words. It was not an explosion. It was more like a lock that has been waiting for the correct key, finally turning. A sound you feel in the bone rather than hear, a rightness so fundamental it reclassifies everything that came before it as merely preliminary. He kissed her. She kissed him back. The fire in the grate was irrelevant. The announcement of the mate bond between the Alpha King and the woman who had been found in the snow outside his north gate did not arrive before the Northern Pack Councils as a question or a proposal. It arrived as a declaration. Kael Varek had governed the Northern Territories for 15 years with the kind of precision that left very little room for argument. And when he arrived before his assembled council, 4 days after the mate bond completed itself, he arrived with the specific composure of a man who has resolved something he has been holding at distance for a very long time and finds the resolution completely legible. Sera stood beside him. This was not, she had been clear about, something she intended to do quietly. She had arrived at this decision over 2 days, and a great deal of conversation and one significant argument in which she had told him with great force that she would stand beside him and not behind him, or she would not stand in a formal capacity at all. And he had said, obviously, in a tone that suggested he had assumed this all along, which had briefly annoyed her, and then mostly made her want to laugh. She was wearing a gown from his household wardrobe, borrowed, 2 long by 2 inches, dark blue, entirely more formal than anything she had worn in her life. She had pulled her hair back the way she always pulled it back. Because she was not trying to look like someone else. She was trying to look like herself in circumstances that had, very recently, changed. Lord Draven was the first to raise the formal objection. He did it correctly and procedurally, and with the particular caution of a man who knows he is objecting, but is not sure how far he intends to take it. The objection was, in substance, the same as the objection always was. She was unranked. She was packless. The Ashfin affiliation had been severed. Kael let him finish. Then he said, with a precision and finality that closed every door Draven was attempting to hold open, the mate bond of the Alpha King confers rank. That is not a courtesy, and it is not a negotiation, and it does not require the endorsement of the council. The question of what the Ashfin pack owed her before she was my mate is a separate matter, which I intend to address separately. He looked at Draven specifically. I would encourage the Ashfin Alpha to take that address seriously. Draven said nothing more. Casvin, who had been watching Kael with the expression of a man watching something he predicted but is still moved by the confirmation of, said, "The Northern Packs will want to see her." "They will see her," Kael said. "They will see that her wolf, which they are welcome to meet in any formal setting they choose, is not broken and has never been broken." It was waiting. There is a difference. He paused. Any pack that struggles to understand the difference can have it explained to them at length. Sera, beside him, felt her wolf stretch out to its full extraordinary extent in her chest, the immense and patient creature finally occupying the space it had always occupied without apology, and she thought about a Tuesday morning and a self-satisfied man and a dismissal delivered in measured tones and everything that had followed it. The road east, the wrong turn north, the boots that weren't enough for the winter, the gates and the embossed wolves, and the snow that was so soft. And she thought that there was a version of those events in which she had not run out of walking precisely where she did. And she felt, toward that version, the profound gratitude of the near miss. The understanding that the difference between that outcome and this one had been measured in feet, 3 feet. She had made it 3 feet past the iron gate. She thought about the women who had told her she was a problem. She thought about the wolf that sat in her chest for 23 years and would not do what wolves were supposed to do. She thought about a man on horseback looking up at a winter sky with an expression that had nothing cold in it. And then she looked at the man beside her, who was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the specific and privately held warmth of someone who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this. "She is Luna," Kael said. Into the council chamber, into the assembled political weight of the Northern Territories, into the silence that had followed his last sentence and showed no sign of refilling itself. His voice was level and final, and entirely without room for revision. "And I would like someone," he added. And there was something in his voice, now that was neither king nor alpha, but something more raw and more true than either. "To give me a reason why I shouldn't love someone who was made to find me, even if it took her 23 years and 4 days of walking and the entire northern winter to get here." No one in the room offered a reason. That evening, they walked in the South Garden. The snow did not collect there, as he had promised. The stone paths were clear, pale with cold air but free of ice, and the winter-pruned hedges cast long shadows across the ground, and the sky above them was the specific blue-black of a clear northern night, dense with stars in a way that made Sera feel, as she had not felt in years, that the world was very large and she was not too small for it. She was wearing his coat. It was far too big for her. She had not intended to be wearing his coat. She had come out with her own borrowed cloak, and then it had become apparent within 30 seconds that the cloak was not adequate for the North Garden in winter. And he had taken his coat off and put it over her without any discussion, she had accepted without any discussion, which seemed to be how things worked between them. She said, "What happens now?" He said, "A great deal of politics." She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and she heard the surprise in it. The surprise of finding herself in possession of an unguarded laugh in a circumstance she had not foreseen. "Can you be more specific?" "The council will require a formal presentation," he said. "There are 5 major packs. 2 of them will have significant questions. One of them, not Ashvin, but neighboring, will have a daughter they had been expecting me to consider, which I am not going to consider, but which will require careful management. Kasvin will want to move quickly. He'll argue that a swift, decisive public presentation is better than a slow political process." He paused. "He's right. He usually is." She said, "You like him." "I trust him," he said, "which is more rare and more useful." She considered that. "What about the Ashvin Alpha?" His jaw tightened very briefly in the way it did when he was managing something he has decided not to act on impulsively. "He violated pack covenant," he said. "He had an obligation to his pack members, and he treated it as optional. That will be addressed through formal channels. Publicly. I want every pack in the Northern Territory to understand what that covenant means and what happens when it is treated otherwise." She said quietly, "You're doing that for me." He looked at her. "You don't have to," she said. "I'm not. I don't need it. What he did, it was awful, and I was devastated, and I also survived it, and I'm standing in your garden right now, which is not a situation that suggests I lost. I don't need revenge." "It's not revenge," he said. "It's precedent. There are other women in other packs who are being extended the same so-called courtesies that was extended to you. The acknowledgement that it's a covenant violation isn't for you specifically. It's for them." She looked at him in the dark garden, under the blue-black northern sky, and she thought about what it was to have a wolf that sat very still for 23 years, and then, upon meeting exactly the right person, revealed itself as something vast and sure-footed and entirely without the flaws anyone had told her it possessed. She thought about what it was to discover that the thing you had been told was broken was not broken at all, had never been broken, was in fact the specific and necessary shape of a thing built to fit exactly one corresponding shape in the world, and that she had found that shape by collapsing face first in the snow outside its gate. "I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it. She heard herself say it with the slight, helpless surprise of someone honest has outrun their caution again. And she looked at him and waited. He stopped walking. He turned to look at her with the expression she had first glimpsed on a 19-year-old's imagined face on a man on horseback in a border town. The longing toward something expression, the unguarded moment, the man behind the king's surface. Only it was not longing now. It was arrival, he said. I have been waiting for you for 15 years without knowing who you were. And you are the sharpest mind I've spoken to in a decade. And your wolf is the most extraordinary thing I have ever felt. And you collapse in my snow and tell me pack governance texts have errors in chapter 4 and argue with me about whether you belong here while wearing my coat and looking at my stars. He took one step toward her, and his hands came up to her face in the way they had, that deliberate and careful way. How could I not love you? She pressed her face into his palm. She felt her wolf stretch forward. She felt his answer. The stars above the north garden were very clear and very cold and entirely indifferent to the particular warmth accumulating below them. Two wolves finally still after a very long wait, and the snow that did not collect in the south garden, because he had told her it wouldn't, lay bright and quiet on the grounds beyond the hedge. And the palace was warm, and the gates were open, and she was exactly where she had been walking toward the entire time without knowing it. Inside, at last, and there to stay.